long time. And I haven't worked with them for the last, I'd say, I don't know, 8, 9 years, whatever, but going back, Sidman's the guy to talk to. Long time. And I haven't worked with them for the last, I'd say, I don't know, 8, 9 years, whatever, but going back, Sidman's the guy to talk to.
Cool.
Long time. And I haven't worked with them for the last, I'd say, I don't know, 8, 9.
Sorry about that. The YouTube loop was happening again because I wasn't my computer was not muted.
No worries. So waiting for Nick to chime in. Okay. Hello there, Nick.
Hey, Dr. Fick, how's it going?
I just sent you an email. I thought maybe you were just being absent-minded for a second and forgot that we were having a colloquium.
I know that'd be bad. Has that happened at all recently?
Not yet. Don't jinx me on that one. We're so far the semester's been going really well with that. So, how you doing? Okay?
Yeah, doing okay. I think ever since the defense and like submitting my dissertation, it's just been a little bit of like a okay, now what type feeling, but it's been
You're
good.
official now. Yeah, you're past the defense stage, so you're in good shape. This is really the last hurdle, right?
Yeah, the very last one, and then this in teaching, and then that's about it. But how's everything been for you?
Well, for an old guy, I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. I can't complain. You know, I heard you did a really nice job with the intro quant stuff online, so congratulations
Awesome.
with that.
Thanks.
It's really tough course to teach online.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's definitely a fun course trying to like thinking back to like things in my undergrad that I disliked about some of my intro courses and trying to like rectify those. But
That's cool. Anyway, I'm gonna do my best at pronouncing your last name, Dao correct?
that's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do my best. You know, I do this a lot because my name FIK for years, people used to call me Fix all the time. With the X, I'm saying I always get a kick out of Fix. So, anyways, I had a good econometrics professor I worked with for almost a year, and he was convinced my name was FIX. And when I spelled it FIK, he goes, "You misspelled your last name on the paper." I'm like, no, that's my name. He didn't know.
Oh yeah.
So, stuff like that happens.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, I've noticed that. So my grandparents are from the Ukraine, and I've noticed that like the Canadian family pronounces a lot different than the actual Ukrainian family, and so I've just kind of come to the conclusion that there's no necessarily correct way of saying it.
Right.
So.
Well, actually, for the Polish side, when I was growing up, the pronunciation of my name ended up being Fik. It was almost
are you Polish?
Yeah, like that, yeah. Which was strange, but yeah. Anyways,
great.
we got a couple minutes. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to give a brief introduction. I'm just going to talk just a second or two about who you are, your degrees, and your research interests, just briefly, 1 minute, not even 45 seconds. And then you'll be taking over the program right now. Mike Simonovich is recording this. It's on a lag with the YouTube. So he's going to edit all that out from start to finish. So when you start, he'll have that posted. So yeah,
sounds great.
Sounds
great.
Do
you have anybody like in person right now?
Yes, Olivier Walter will be here in person. He shows up on a regular basis. Sometimes Jane Southworth always pops in on as well. I see her. She's on. She's
right now.
Yeah, Jane comes in once in a while.
Yeah.
Awesome. So
Okay,
no students in person though?
No, some of them go in the grad lab, Nick, and they put it up on the big screen down in the grad lab, and they all watched on there.
Oh, that's cool. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Now we got 2 screens going in here. So Olivier's got one and I've got one. So we're very spoiled. Okay, it's 3 o'clock, everybody. Welcome to the Department of Geography Colloquium Series for 2021. Yes, indeed. And today's speaker is Nick Dao, and he is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography. And he recently just defended his dissertation, and what he will be doing today is the last hurdle, giving his presentation. We'll be hearing about some of his research. Nick has a bachelor's degree in geography from the University of New Hampshire. He has a master's of science in natural resources, also from the University of New Hampshire. And his research interests are very wide and varied, but if we had to boil it down to a handful of phrases, we would probably say community-based participatory research would be one. Conservation would be another. I think global health is something else he's very interested in, and international development. So take her away, Nick.
Great. And then do I have screen sharing? I think I just need to be enabled as a host.
Yes, Mike Simonovich, you should be able to share. Where is Mike Simonovich? He should be here. Let's see, he should be able to grant you, and if not, let's see if I can do that too.
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
There you go. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. Let me get up here. I'm guessing everybody can see that I'm
going to switch over.
All right. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. As Dr. Fick was saying, I'm a PhD candidate just finishing up, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about my dissertation research that over the last 5 years I've been conducting. So let's see. Just a quick outline of the dissertation research itself. I'm going to start off with a little introduction, talking about the motivation behind the study, talk about the study area and the different research phases. And then today I'm only going to touch on 2 of the papers from my dissertation. There's just not enough time to touch on the third, but I'll touch a bit more on that in the concluding statements about. Oh, yeah.
Interrupt you, Nick. We don't see your slides yet. Can you just double check on the screen share that we have your slides?
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no problem.
You can see them.
I can, so half can see, half can.
Hang on, select view options, it says.
You'll see, we're not seeing it.
Okay, so if everyone goes up to view options at the very, very top, we can choose Nick Dauhiniak instead of Mike Simonovich on the screen. And then you will be able to see Nick's talk.
Oh, perfect. So everybody looks good?
You're good to go.
Awesome. All right. And then just finished up with some concluding statements about the project itself. So a little bit of background on the research topic and my motivation for doing it is, as we're thinking about health globally, oftentimes we've really been focusing on infectious disease. And I mean, right now with COVID, it earns its place in our minds. But in the back of everything that's happening is there's now a double burden of disease, which we like to call, which is a simultaneously non-communicable disease burden at the same time as an infectious disease burden. Actually, globally, non-communicable diseases are now the leading cause of death worldwide. And by 2030 in low-income countries, non-communicable diseases are actually going to outpace infectious diseases. And as we're thinking about how we continue to address health issues globally in an interconnected basis, this becomes a challenge for global health. For a while with infectious disease, we really focus on disease-specific approaches, and there's advantages to that for infectious diseases especially. They're efficient, you can direct them, and that way they're really good, but it has led to underdeveloped government health systems in a lot of cases. And thinking about primary healthcare and expanding primary healthcare with non-communicable diseases, it's really necessary for the long continuum of care associated with non-communicable diseases. And then we're in now a position where, in especially a lot of low and middle income countries, where we lack a lot of epidemiological data on non-communicable diseases themselves. And so what is primary healthcare? I mentioned it last slide. Essentially, it's the most basic package of essential health services and products needed to prevent disease, promote health, and manage illness. And it covers about 80% of health needs during a person's lifetime. And it's important to say that this includes public health. So not just curative medicine, but also our preventative public health steps that we take. And there's 3 components ultimately to primary healthcare. And we're going to really focus on the last 2, but they include meeting people's health needs throughout their lives, addressing the broader determinants of health through multi-sectoral policy and action, and empowering individuals, families, and communities to take charge of their own health. So going back to number 2, especially as Americans, we often think of health in very individual terms. We think of, personal responsibility and health, but really there's so much more, so many more influences on health than just our individual influences or our individual choices. There's a lot of ecological influences they can be called. And so when thinking about health, it's really helpful to frame things through a social ecological model. And so through a social ecological model, ultimately, if you look here, you have the individual in the center of the model. And then as you go out, you have the interpersonal, community, local institutional, and policy, culture, and customs all having influences on the person. So these different multi-level influences can constrain or help to empower and enable a person's choices and abilities. And so now going to number 3, research and agenda practice setting. We talked about an important part of primary public health is that empowering and engaging of end users and communities. But as we're thinking about who sets the research agenda and the practice agenda, oftentimes, the end users aren't always at that seat. And so this is really what the start of this research project is going to focus on. So in health and development research, it really does remain an area where priorities are set almost exclusively still by researchers' individual interests or by funding organizations. And this is especially true when it comes to research focusing on end users, especially for marginalized communities, and especially in areas of the global south. So people tend to remain researched on, not researched with. And this is even in the context of the knowledge that we have that grassroots engagement and multi-stakeholder collaborations are important in obtaining the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, so much that a target in SDG Goal 17 is specifically related to this. So there's a lot of talk about community-based interventions and community-based research in this presentation. And so why focus on community-based interventions? Well, they're an important entry point for primary health and preventative healthcare because the people that live their daily lives within communities often know their situation best. And often, you want to blend people's lived experience with the theoretical and research experiences of different practitioners or researchers themselves. So community leaders, community groups, village health workers have a wealth of knowledge and are vital assets in case detection and management, prevention of disease and illness, communication regarding risk factors, and the reduction of stigma. And as community-based interventions and researches have been gaining more and more steam, and there's been a stress of importance, especially from medical anthropology, of the importance of ground-up, open-ended, community-based research that ultimately prioritizes and gives voice to preferences, perceptions, and priorities of community members, and is adaptive to unanticipated changes in research agenda based on community input. And this is where community-based research, community-based participatory research really becomes a helpful framework for operating in. So it's a research framework focusing on true partnership and participation by community members. You ultimately are leveraging that theoretical expertise of a researcher and the invaluable lived experiences of community members. And especially when we're thinking about, public health work on a global scale, all the cultural based assumptions that could be brought into that work. An approach like this helps to integrate local biopsychosocial models of health and helps to bridge that gap between local and global knowledge. So you'd ultimately move in towards a situation where the community is researched with, not necessarily researched on. And there's a major distinction from community engaged research in that the community selects the topic study and is included within the process itself. So the study area for this this work is in northern Uganda. So the village is just north of the city of Gulu. We're going to use a pseudonym for the city or for the village. It's called Kuch. Dominant ethnic group is the Choli. And one of the really unique characteristics of this area that's had major influences on lived experiences of people is that there was a 20-year civil war from 1986 to 2006 between the Ugandan government and the Lord's Resistance Army. And this community in particular was the site of one of the largest massacres of that 20-year war. And during that time span of 20 years, about 95% of the district's population were displaced into internal displaced people's camps. So this is just like a general overview of the research process itself. We're going to focus on this. So this is the first paper that we're going to talk about, and this is that health issue definition. So thinking back to the introduction, we're trying to figure out ways that we can incorporate community perceptions and community agenda setting into the research process itself, so leaving it open-ended. Then for the second paper, we'll move into a grounded theory survey, trying to better understand the clinical reality and explanatory models within a socio-ecological model of the community. And then that last chapter that we won't necessarily touch on was engaging community members in their perceptions and potential constraints of evidence-based non-pharmacological, well, in this case, you'll see it turns to alcohol use disorders, but ultimately that's left open at this stage in the research process. And then just frame this research in the overall context of this work. It's not going to end with the research itself. There's going to be the co-development of public health programming associated with this across the social ecological model, and ultimately iterative process of evaluation and change to facilitate the actual implementation of a program. So the importance of the research ultimately isn't just the health-specific results or information, but also the process of the research itself. So collecting data to identify community-based priorities for research, and then conducting research based on those priorities identified. And then ultimately there is the big question of, can this be effectively implemented in a PhD project with all the constraints related to it? So starting off, the first paper we'll talk about is setting a research agenda to improve community health, an inclusive mixed methods approach in Northern Uganda. And if you're interested in this paper more, this was published recently in PLOS One. So in order to get from this idea of including communities in the end users in the research selection process, we need to figure out a methodology to use, and ultimately gravitated towards Photovoice. And so Photovoice is a method where you distribute cameras to community members. Community members take an active role in the data collection process. So cameras are distributed, and then people go out and take photos of their environment based on a prompt. And then you bring back those photos and include them within individual interviews and focus group discussions. And so we use this method ultimately to narrow into a topic. And so Photovoice is great for communicating ideas across cultural and language barriers and empowering or giving a quote unquote voice to marginalized communities. Ultimately, it's been shown to be effective in identifying research issue in a participatory framework. And it's a form of participatory action research itself. But ultimately, you're thinking about praxis, so informed and collective, reflective collective action to address an issue based on the PAR research to influence social change through this iterative process of knowledge generation, action, and reflection. So the research goals for this paper, what are the major drivers of health in the Cooch community? But also we're gonna focus really on identifying that public health issue for future study and co-development of an intervention itself. So to really root this in this CBPR inspired framework, the first step was to establish a community advisory board. And so community advisory board is essentially a group of community members who have a formal place within the research process itself. So the idea behind it is you're institutionalizing community-based input and feedback into the research process. So a CAB, as we're going to call it, helps ensure the project was conducted in a culturally sensitive manner, provides input on results and project direction, and ultimately serves as a general source of community knowledge and a conduit between the researchers and community members. So if there are issues with the research process, the community advisory board is a great place to go in order to have that dialogue with the end user community. So the identification and recruitment for this board members took place over about a 3 to 4 period. So before the research started, it was just a lot of informal discussions with community leaders and meeting and participating in community events over about a 3 to 4 month period before the research really began. The identification and recruitment of these board members, the eligibility for the CAB, it was people that lived in the community since the conflict, were widely connected and respected by the community, not a politician, and a reputation for being responsible and trustworthy. And you can see why that time at the beginning in the community is really important in order to get a feel for these selection criteria. And then ultimately the final selection included a head teacher, leader of a local women's group, and a local representative of a local NGO. So the Photovoice process, based on other past Photovoice studies, we included a group of 8 individuals. And so a small number of people, but in order to get plenty of time with the camera and also to have plenty of time to interview and to have a lot of discussions. The selection was based on input from the CAB, but ultimately the criteria were live across a diverse geographic range of Cooch, were informed about community issues, were responsible, and would take seriously the responsibility of representing the community. So not only representing their own individual viewpoints or their own individual needs, but would take into account that they're representing more people than just themselves. The first step in this process after the recruitment was the photography and photo voice training and ethics review, where met with all 8 participants, answered questions, went through a photography training session, did situational training where to know what not to take photos of, to learn about respectful use of camera and ethical use of cameras, and ultimately how to obtain informed consent from the people that were in the photos themselves. And so with this process being a very wide open topic to start and then narrowing, and as the research progresses, the prompt was, what in your community has a negative or positive impact on health for you and your community? So purposely kept vague in order to not bias the direction of the research process itself. Individual interviews happened after the 2 weeks that everybody had with the camera. All the photos were taken on a digital camera, uploaded to tablet. And at the beginning of the individual interviews with each individual participant, they selected the 5 photos that they felt best represented the prompt and what they wanted to discuss. And so they had to think over the photos and what they wanted to discuss. Following the individual interviews where we discussed those photos, reconvened with the entire group into focus groups where ultimately interactions and disagreements were observed. And then the health issue that was most important was selected for the future stages of the study. And so the sequence of the first paper, just to bring everything together, is the creation of the CAB, participant selection, photography workshop, individual interviews, focus group, issue selection. And then after the photo voice results, we'll talk about this cross-sectional baseline survey, and then we'll funnel directly into paper 2 from that. So quick summary of photo voice participant demographics. Ages range from 25 to 50 with an average about 40. Highest level of education attained was between primary 2 to secondary 4, but 1 to 7 children, 5 on average. And the occupation of everybody was a farmer, but people are also bead makers, boda drivers or motorcycle taxi drivers, and a preacher. So by far, and this is what we'll focus on for the most part throughout the rest of the presentation, is alcohol use. Alcohol use, regardless of geographic location within the community, everybody agreed was the greatest challenge. And there really wasn't any disagreement about this or challenging between participants that this was the greatest impact. There are multi-dimensional impacts, and we'll touch again more on this in paper 2, but direct health impacts, impacts to family life, and the impacts for planning for the future. Other topics that came up were water quality and sanitation. This varied more, but based on the geographic location of an individual. You can imagine that the further you are away from a functioning borehole, the more unsafe access you had, and the more you had to deal with frequent gastrointestinal discomfort. And then everybody was basically in agreement of proper sanitation. So this is proper latrine, a hand washing station, just drying racks, separation of animals from food, and slashing of grass. And just to go back, this is actually a brewing setup of people making the local, like a local distillery type thing. And then finally, another common issue was poor infrastructure. And so this was, again, one that varied based on geographic location in the community. Disagreement on quality of roads and significant issue, but ultimately people that lived closer to graded roads felt like roads were fine. More remote areas where the road quality went down felt there was a greater impact on their lives, including during rainy season when things flood and people have to cross flooded swamps and potentially drown. So now turning our attention back to alcohol use disorders, next was, we identified the need through photo voice, but we wanted to triangulate that with a cross-sectional baseline survey. And so to do that, used the alcohol use disorder identification test, which is a World Health Organization instrument based on 10 questions to gauge alcohol consumption. Ultimately, through those questions, you classify people into these 4 categories. So low risk or no alcohol use disorder. And then all 3 of these are considered an alcohol disorder of varying magnitude. Hazardous drinking, harmful use, and alcohol dependence being the most severe. A clustered random sample was used, and then following that, probability weights were applied to correct for sampling bias for sex and age based on census data. And then associations between sex, age, and alcohol use disorders were tested using bivariate and multivariate logistic regression. So looking at that, the total sample was about 327 people. Break this down because there's a lot here. 76% of people were considered low risk or abstinent, and then over 20% were considered to have an alcohol use disorder. But if you look at the pattern, you actually have increasing severity of alcohol use disorders. So about 11% of people with a probable alcohol dependence. In terms of the difference between men and women, men were significantly more likely to have an alcohol use disorder. Only about 60% were abstinent, with about 20.66% exhibiting alcohol dependence. And if you look at the age groups, ultimately you have, as people get older, generally higher rates of alcohol use disorders. And then so talking about the bivariate and multivariate analysis, men are about 7.4 times more likely to have an alcohol use disorder than women. And looking at the age, very borderline significance, probably due to power. But you have about, a significant relationship between 31 to 59 age cohort and 18 to 30 age cohort, with about 1.7 times more likely. So now thinking about alcohol use disorders and framing them, and why are they important? Well, Uganda has one of the highest rates of alcohol consumption in the world. And previous studies in this region have placed northern Uganda between a prevalence of alcohol use disorders ranging from 4.3% to 21.5%. And we'll talk about the reasons for those differences in the limitations and strengths of the study. But results here ultimately show higher levels and more severe patterns of alcohol use disorders, including alcohol dependence, than all 3 prior studies, with about 16.45 percentage points higher than WHO estimates for alcohol use disorders for Uganda. And then thinking about alcohol use disorders as a general topic, they're highly important to public health. Alcohol use disorders are about fully or partially responsible for about 230 diseases or injuries globally. And you have a relationship between socioeconomic status and educational backgrounds and increased vulnerability due to excessive alcohol consumption. People who fall or come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to have a higher proportion of income go towards alcohol use disorders. And there's generally less social and environmental buffers for the negative impacts of alcohol consumption. And then looking at alcohol use disorders as a non-communicable disease, and the underfunding through development assistance for health towards NCDs. So non-communicable diseases account for about 73% of mortality and about 62% of disease burden, and continue to rise. But development assistance for health only allocated about 1.78% of the total global budget to NCDs, and that is about in line with Uganda in particular. But ultimately, the results of this study highlight that tension between macro level decisions and priority setting from external researchers and funders and donors, and the priorities of target communities. And so it's not necessarily to say that this is the only way, but it's more about looking at this as a potential way to augment current donor-driven agenda setting with bottom-up agenda setting, since this could further bridge that divide between local realities and global priorities, could better serve community health needs and goals, and then foster critical consciousness and community level engagement. So some of the strengths and limitations, using the quantitative data to triangulate the Photovoice conclusions is definitely a strength. And then compared to past work, the alcohol units when conducting the alcohol use disorder survey often didn't include local distilled alcohol, which is the most prevalent form of alcohol in these communities. So if you look at the way past studies calculated it, it's likely that it might have led to an undercount. There are also limitations of this. Obviously, extrapolating the results outside of Cooch, you need to proceed with caution with that recall bias associated with the audit. And then if particular demographics were absent from households due to working or traveling away. Representative of that audit survey could be impacted, but sampling weights were used to attempt to correct for that. And then moving into paper 2, so we won't really have an introduction to this because everything's kind of is flowing together. So, we talked a little bit about alcohol use disorders and why they're important to study in the last paper, but now we're going to move into trying to understand more of the local context of alcohol use disorders in Cooch. And so to do that, employed constructivist grounded theory. Constructivist grounded theory is a qualitative methodology rooted in adductive inquiry, and it's emergent methodology. So it really fits within this analysis of starting broad and continuing to narrow in. And so now we're at alcohol use disorders and we're trying to narrow into more specifics, but we're doing that through letting that topic come through data and through discussions with participants. So that the direction and focus is purposely kept broad in this section too, but ultimately the goal is to develop a theory of a phenomena and to investigate the broad topic of alcohol use disorders in Cooch while letting that focus emerge from the data. So participant recruitment for this was again done in close consultation with the CAB. Early participant selection was based on individuals residing in Cooch who consumed large quantities of alcohol regularly and people that were over the age of 18 years old. And so worked with the community advisory board to help with the selection of those individuals. Constant compared method was used in conjunction with theoretical sampling. And this is really unique to grounded theory where every time you collect a new interview, you instantly go back, code that data, begin to analyze that data, and then use that data to direct your future sampling strategies. And so as you go through the process of grounded theory, you're coding the data, analyzing it, developing a theory, and then trying to poke holes on that theory and trying to refine, elaborate, or dismiss a category or emerging theory. So individual interviews were transcribed and coded for social and psychological processes through iterative 3 nonlinear coding strategies or stages prior to subsequent interview to pursue leads and guide future selection of interviewees for theoretical development. And semi-structured interviews were used and really close attention was paid to tacit meanings that participants may hold. So if somebody says something, to really investigate the meaning behind the words in order to get more into what people are talking about and how people are thinking about the processes of alcohol use disorders. So it resulted in about 35 interviews, ages between 18 to 75 with an average of 43. Most had some primary school education, most were married, and most consumed alcohol. But there was some inclusion of absent participants or previous drinkers. And so this is ultimately the theory that came throughout this process. I'm going to break this down in one by one, concept by concept, but ultimately this is a process that happens constantly that people navigate throughout the day, both consciously and subconsciously. Starting off at the assessing the situation concept. So generally at the start of this, a situational assessment is undertaken. People seek to understand their situation that they find themselves in. Oftentimes this was happening in terms of life meaning and purpose, and through those events and experiences that have accumulated in somebody's life, both the acute events and the more chronic events. And this is a particular concept that is highly influenced by mediating factors such as gender, age, and employment, and their high levels of influence from socio-political environment, for instance, the conflict, population growth, and economic opportunity. So as somebody's reflecting on life meaning and purpose, that provided rich explanatory power for the situational assessment. And so this includes things like community social connection and family well-being. And as you start to talk to people would talk about work and jobs and money as what's important. But as you really, interrogate that meaning and look into those tacit assumptions, a lot of that was due to not being necessarily an end, but a means in order to help influence and help fellow community members to provide for family members. So a lot of meaning and purpose coming through those outlets. And this is ultimately shaped differently by age, but due to time constraints, I can't go too much into this, but changing traditions due to the conflict played a large role in the relationship between the youth and elders. So a lot of deteriorating respect to elders and having substantial impacts on elder conceptualizations of life meaning and purpose. Also influencing the situational assessment is accumulating trauma and regret, so including loss of family members or others in the community, chronic poverty, and also regret of past choices and the current impact, especially on family. So from the assessing situation concept, you move into the appraising options concept. And so here, you start to navigate care availability and social support within an illness explanatory model. And so I didn't have necessarily time to get into illness explanatory models, but there's the way that people make sense of their illness, including why them, different treatment strategies that people could follow, explanations for how the illness works. But ultimately, their illness models and treatment strategies are shaped by lack of available care here. There really isn't much available for, or there isn't really anything available for both mental health needs or alcohol use disorders. And much relies on this idea of, people were often quoted as saying, changing from the heart, where people were expected if to make their own situation change. But ultimately, other explanations came a lot from spiritual aspects. So this idea of burying the bottle was where if somebody wanted to quit, in order to show commitment to that, people would bury a bottle of that liquor, or it could be playing cards if somebody's addicted to gambling. And then you ultimately have to slaughter a goat or an animal in order to start drinking that alcohol again. And if that doesn't happen, sickness can come up. So somebody said, I witnessed another man in the village here who buried Legero, but went to a funeral and he was given that alcohol and drunk it unknowingly. Immediately he came home and got an attack, had a very swollen stomach. He called the elders and confessed to drinking what he had already buried. And immediately the elders had to kill a goat to remove away the misfortune. So he got well, and up to now he is alive. For really severe alcohol use disorders, where people tend to say that that person was married to alcohol, or somebody that's married to alcohol, it's said to be incurable, unable to change from the heart. Generally, people view that as charming. So a lot of spiritual aspects, that somebody who's jealous to you cursed you, and now all you can do is think about alcohol, and all you can do is drink alcohol. So usually this is when people, what people do to charm you. They'll burn your money and they will put it in your alcohol, so that each and every money that you get, you go drinking with it. You may not buy sugar or buy clothing, but you want to drink. Other aspects that were discussed here were religion and clan approaches. But these were two of the findings that we're going to discuss here. But ultimately, I wanted to talk next about coping by heavy episodic drinking. So after somebody goes through this situational assessment, appraises their options, you'll see that people either exit this loop over here to low risk drinking or abstinence, or come back here into coping by heavy episodic drinking. And this can lead to a heavy episodic drinking feedback loop, negative feedback loop, where somebody goes here, potentially has a bad experience within while using alcohol, accumulating trauma and regret attributable to drinking, comes back to that situational assessment impacted by that, and potentially repeats the process without a lot of options in order to escape it. Or somebody can just drink and come back here without much impact. Coping by heavy episodic drinking, very prominent form of coping, but I want to, this was defined very broadly. So not only emotional and mental health related needs, but also social and coping within social contexts. So thinking about peer pressure and coping with drinking for friendship. People use alcohol to cope with and forget about the past. I drink to forget about the past. I drink to relieve myself from stress and fatigue. I went through a lot of traumatic events. My children were killed. And not only my children, I was also abducted, and I have several injuries in my body due to the abduction. So without alcohol, it's not easy to find sleep. I continue to think about it. And also coping with regret. So for instance, young people often talked about their education. At times I drink to replace some missing things in my life. I miss my education. I don't have the finances to continue with school. If I see my age mates going to school, I feel hurt. So I drink to try to forget about that. And then oftentimes older respondents talk about regret in terms of not having been able to provide everything they wanted to their family. And then there are also poverty and health issues, which, thinking about everything we've talked about, this quote's a little bit long, but I think it really encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about, and really shows the complexity to a lot of what people are going through and dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I started drinking when I discovered I was HIV positive and my husband had a disability. He has cancer in the foot. Half of his foot has been eaten away by cancer. I don't know where we got HIV from, but I suspect it's my husband who infected me with HIV. I hardly sleep if I don't drink. I have so much in my mind that I cannot get a grain of sleep every day, so I resorted to alcohol for comfort. I want my children to live a better life, just like the life their father was giving to them. But then I'm just a single person. I have to feed them, I have to house them, I have to let them go to school. And to me, it is so stressful. There are times when I fail to make a decision to go to the garden or not. Whenever I go to the garden, I have a bottle of alcohol. I put it in the direct ahead of me where I'm going to dig. And when I reach a spot, I have a drink and continue. So the only way I can dig is if I have alcohol in front of me. I stayed for a long time in the hospital with him, and now he is back home. But I'm still left with the burden of taking care of him always. I always realized that it is only through drinking that I can comfortably sit among people and put a smile on my face. If I'm not drunk, I feel deep pain down in my heart. It hurts me that certain things are happening in my life. So I made friends with alcohol because of that. If only my husband would get fine. If only he would get healed to get better from these wounds, and we start working together to take care of the children, I would have no reason to drink. But what worries me is they say that if you have cancer, you are most likely to die. And now that stresses me. I know if my husband is fine, there won't be so much going towards taking care of his medical bills. I would save more and I would begin selling in the market. I would have money to go buy things and go sit among the women in the market. Sitting and discussing with these women in the market would help me forget my troubles. I used not to drink. I was never a drunkard. I just started drinking now. What pains me is how I will manage to take care of my children. But trust me, if there is any way I could live a responsible life, I could live a meaningful life and find something to take care of my children, I will never drink. I was never a drunkard. Being HIV positive, in the hospital, they teach us that you should avoid stressful situations. You should not be thinking so much. And that is the reason why I try as much as possible to dodge it. When I drink, I dodge all the bad thoughts. It is put in the past. As long as I don't drink and forget about my medication, I don't drink and forget to give food to my children, I don't drink and forget that I'm a mother. Those are the things that worry me. So we talked a little bit about coping by heavy episodic drinking, but then there's also this low risk for drinking or abstinence concept. And so the decision not to drink can really be complex. You know, there's religion at play, responsibility, and being satisfied with life purpose. But one of the big concepts, time and time again, was gender. So a number of women who did not drink expressed the need to be primary caretaker as abstinence or lack of high risk drinking for reasons for that. And ultimately that meaning and purpose derived from providing for family interacts with male spouses neglecting their responsibilities. My husband drinks so much. He drinks that he never saves even a coin, doesn't know even which school his children goes to. So I made up my mind that I would not drink so that I can support my family and care for my children. I started looking at my mother's children. They were so young. And I thought if I continue drinking and being stressed, then I wouldn't take care of them. So I got back to my senses and started taking proper care of them. And one of our children was in primary 6. So he went to senior 1. His school fees were being paid by an NGO. That was when I realized that I had to be strong and work to take care of them. So ultimately that's the process. And again, like I said, this isn't necessarily like a one-off process, but it continues constantly as people navigate their day-to-day lives, assessing situation. And it's both a conscious and subconscious process. So life meaning and purpose really came out as being an important topic and concept within this analysis. And so past studies have shown that high measures in life meaning and purpose are inversely related to substance use or the successful reduction of substance use through psychological interventions and lower levels of depressive symptoms and treatment. And so where this study is really helpful is in situating those locally based concepts of life purpose and meaning, including those related to individuals' work, family, spiritual fulfillment, and contributions to community members. But as thinking about going ahead and thinking about ways to address alcohol use disorders, there are a lot of structural and environmental barriers that could potentially confront community members as they attempt to address life meaning and purpose. A lot of macro challenges, things from high population growth and lack of jobs, threats to agricultural livelihoods and economies due to climate change, and a high proportion of debt repayment to revenue, which ultimately can inhibit domestic funding for social services. These really need to be thought of as strategies are being developed to address the social determinants of alcohol use disorders. There's also PTSD and trauma. Like we talked about in the beginning, there's a 20-year civil war having substantial impacts on the mental health in the area. And since alcohol is used to cope with both acute and chronic trauma, mental health needs really do need to be addressed in order to reduce alcohol use disorders within the community also. This is especially shown in literature of other post-conflict areas. And then finally, gender. Past research was mixed on if gender responsibilities influence higher or low level of drinking, such as this, but a lot of times in those areas where men relinquish responsibilities to drink, women have tended to have to take on those increased responsibilities that were offloaded. So in this area in particular, following the conflict, men continued to make household decisions while negating their traditional productive roles through alcohol consumption often, while women were forced to assume all the major household roles, including those traditionally assumed by men. And so this could help explain that difference between women in lower age groups and higher age groups, and also obviously the drastic differences between men and women in terms of alcohol consumption. So a few limitations. Within constructive grounded theory, it makes it explicit that the co-construction of theory is between the researchers and participants. But there's no doubt that even with all the memoing, member checking, constant comparison analysis, and making explicit sensitizing concepts, which I didn't have a chance to get to, cultural assumptions could permeate the analysis. Especially true as somebody, as myself, the researcher, who's white Canadian American, grew up in a middle-class suburb, much different context than community members I was partnering with throughout the research process. So conclusions, overarching conclusions, again, going back to the conclusion section of the first paper, is bottom-up research training said it like this could help bridge that divide between local realities and global priorities, better serve community health needs and goals, and foster critical consciousness and community level engagement. Ultimately, this was feasible in planning, with proper planning in the PhD research. And in the actual dissertation, if anybody's ever interested in some of the lessons learned, in my conclusion section, I touch on a lot of these for if any PhD students are interested in employing something similar in the future. And then the partnership between myself and the Cooch community will continue. The third paper that I didn't get a chance to touch on went through different evidence-based approaches through systematic reviews and the like, and then ultimately had focus group discussions with community members on if this is something that would be open or possible within communities, what the constraints are, how can these be worked around, and all this information ultimately is going to go into the next phase of the project of co-developing a public health program in partnership with Cooch community members through a systems level approach to address the social determinants of and barriers to care to alcohol use disorders. And the components of this dissertation will be used in that next phase. So some references, but I'd like to thank my committee members for their guidance and support throughout this process. Dr. Amy Blue, the Social and Behavioral Sciences Department in the Public Health and Health Professionals College, Dr. Brian Child here in Geography, Dr. Greg Glass, my chair here in Geography, and Dr. Sarah McCune of the Environmental and Global Health Department in the Public Health and Health Professionals Department. I also like to thank Suzanne Okeda, who is my amazing, fantastic field assistant and colleague, who none of this would have been possible without her expertise and just amazing translation abilities. So thanks to everybody for that. And thank you all for coming to visit, or for the talk, not to visit.
All right, thank you very much, Nick. And we'll open the floor up for questions. I can ask the first question if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
A lot of the study focuses on the demand, perhaps, side of the equation. What about the supply side of the equation? I'm just curious about how or where the alcohol comes from. Is it just all homegrown, and to what extent are there possible, avenues to control the supply, perhaps limit the supply, because this could be a problem. Alcoholism and alcohol abuse is a huge problem in many portions of society, and we know this, and it's a problem. But is there anything that's going on the supply side that needs to perhaps be looked at? Because we talk about health issues, sometimes you restrict supply, force people to stay sober, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's something that I touched a lot on in the third chapter of the dissertation. And talking with community members, there were past efforts to restrict supply, which is very evidence-based across a policy landscape when it's properly implemented and properly targeted and also enforced. In this case, it had mixed effects. The enforcement wasn't super great when it came down. So there's a enforcement of bars across the district to close at a certain time, and then also banning little plastic bags of hard liquor. It ultimately, according to participants, a lot of what happened was in the rural areas, people were mostly consuming homegrown alcohol and liquor. And so it actually led to a big spike in local brewing of alcohol. And ultimately, a lot of participants said that it kind of made the problem worse in a way. And so thinking about there's a lot of discussion with community members about how you go about that, because it's the tricky thing where the alcohol that's being brewed is a source of livelihood for people in the community, especially women who use that money to pay for their schools or their kids' school fees, pay for the necessities of life. But obviously there are significant externalities associated with that, negative externalities. And so a lot of it was talking about different maybe approaches to income replacement or how that could go in a non-punitive way, which in past literature discussing a lot of this has said that a lot of people support a non-punitive approach to non-recorded alcohol, just because non-recorded alcohol being homebrewed, just because it'll build support for those programs ultimately. But no, it's a great question, and I think it hasn't really been addressed because I think it's the most difficult thing to deal with.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else out there? Some questions for Nick? Fascinating subject, fascinating dissertation.
Thanks so much.
Anybody else out there? People are very tired from all the interviews that have been going on. People have been zooming all day, I think. So I guess if there's no further questions, we're going to move on and say thank you very much, Nick, for a very informative talk. We learned a lot, I think, about community-based participation, research methods, and whatnot. Complicated model, very interesting stuff. And good luck with your research, and congratulations on your defense of your dissertation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Fick, and thanks for everybody for coming to the talk.
Okay, great. Great job. Okay.
Way to go, Nick.
People are zoomed out, Nick. They've been on interviewing, all the faculty's been watching interviews and stuff. So anyway, well, thanks again. Good job. Oh.